In the Uranus cycle video I posted a while back, you can see that just like with transiting Neptune, the Uranus cycle seems particularly relevant during turbulent times in America. The first return to its natal place happens the year before the Civil War started, but was still at those exact degrees right as the combat began in the spring of 1861. Then, you fast forward 84 or so years, and you find the US in the thick of World War II, fighting off the Japanese and the axis of fascist countries in Europe, and intensely focused on building a nuclear bomb to ensure victory no matter what. As mentioned in the recent video on Neptune, in the Civil War years, Neptune was opposing itself, while Uranus returned to its original spot. While in the Second World War mayhem of the early 1940s, Neptune was back home where it started, and whereas the 1860s shows the country at odds with itself, the World War united everyone in the same cause. Neptune aside, we can also say that in the 1960s, with transiting Uranus squaring itself, America was fighting a war in Vietnam that eventually was deemed to be a failure, and at one point almost got into a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Then, when it went through Sagittarius to oppose itself in the 1983-1984 period, the US was at the height of the Cold War paranoia with the Soviet Union, although in that case it was all saber-rattling and it never led to any actual fighting. And more recently, when it squared itself from Pisces, the US invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, saying it was going to be a piece of cake, but in the end it proved to be about as successful as the Vietnam Project. Less US human casualties, but plenty of death, and not a whole lot of achievement around what was actually intended. And now here we are in the decade of the 2020s, with Neptune once again opposing itself like it did in the 1850s and 60s, and with Uranus due to return to its natal spot in 2027 to 2029. At a glance, this has to be serious cause for concern because, astrologically speaking, the two periods are quite similar on account of these two huge planetary forces, and on the practical level because we can already see the discord and division the country is traversing. The question is, what kind of war can we expect? Well, first answer is we're already in it. One party has the advantage of having more voters, the other is resentful on that account, and so wants to change the rules so they can win, even though they're in the minority. This obviously doesn't sit well with the majority, and so the fight is on. Astrologically, there is a somewhat subtle but important contrast between what was happening in the 1860s and what is happening in the current decade of the 2020s. Because Neptune's orbit is right around 165 years, while Uranus's orbit is just about 84, Neptune comes back to where it started a little faster than two Uranus returns, which means by the time you're on the third Uranus return, the one we're in now, the lag increases even more. In other words, by this stage in our history, the Neptune opposition happens years ahead of the Uranus return to its natal place. Back in the Civil War years, those events were separated by 1 to 2 years, whereas now they're more than 5 years apart. If you're a pessimist, then you'll say, well, it's crappy now and it's going to continue to be crappy later, so that most of the decade has to be written off as unpleasant, discordant, and dangerous. However, in my astrological experience, when planets are transiting simultaneously or close to it, the danger increases because the forces are magnified. So, in my opinion, it is better for Uranus to return later, like it is doing this time around. And, on a practical level, we have to remember that the horrible carnage of the 1860s Civil War was due to the fact the South was an almost distinct entity with its own thriving, albeit corrupt economy, but it meant they could actually organize and finance a large army to fight the war. Even so, the opposing army, the ones the good Americans called the good guys, won the battle. In today's environment, it's hard to see how the forces that are against democracy would be able to put together an army big enough to ever result in actual mayhem and carnage. As long as a democratic government is in charge, then if you try to create a militia, army, whatever, you'll be fighting against the actual US Army, which would seem to be a pretty bad idea. However, this all depends on keeping people in power who want to uphold and defend democracy. If the wrong people take charge, we could get into a lot of trouble. And finally, democratically speaking, all we can do is advocate, and most importantly, vote and hope the rule of law defends the outcome. And although it may be true, the good side isn't going to win every battle, the point is to win the overall war. So if you ask me whether the voting war can be won, the answer is yes. And if you ask me whether the rule of law will triumph, the answer is also yes. We won last time, and we're going to win again.